You might have heard there is an election looming. Um, I'll dispense with the levity quickly because the work to secure this election is deadly serious, and fewer is familiar with the task than Cait Conley. Conley is the senior advisor to the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, always a mouthful to say, within the Department of Homeland Security. In that role, she leads CISA's efforts to secure the nation's far-reaching election system in partnership with state and local authorities. It's a huge task that includes fighting misinformation that threatens to undermine public confidence in the system, while countering efforts by hostile nations to interfere in the process fundamental to our democracy. A combat veteran, Conley served as the National Security Council's Director for Counterterrorism before joining CISA, and we're fortunate to have her join us today despite a jam-packed schedule. She's headed to the White House right after this, so I have promised that she'll have an early out by 10:10. So I'm going to turn it over to Cait, and then we'll go to your questions. So welcome, Cait Conley.
When we talk about defending the democratic process, it truly is a team sport. And the role of responsible media is an incredibly important one, especially in this election cycle. So to start from the top, way too gracious of an introduction, but my name is Cait Conley, and I serve as the senior advisor to the director of CISA, but as of last August, I was asked to assume leadership of our election security mission. And with that, I have the incredible privilege of spending an incredible amount of time with state and local election officials around the country, as well as some of our private sector election vendors, and incredible folks like you all and other elements of civil society, and really just the American people. Because at the end of the day, the democratic process really does involve everyone, and everyone plays a crucial role. So to start from the top, for those who may not be as familiar with how the election structure in the U.S. is set up, I will tell you, as someone who joined the Army at the age of 18, I had not been to a polling location, until I was well into my 30s. So I had no idea the complexity of election administration. I was totally naive, where the amount of work that goes in year-round by a wide range of professionals who are truly incredible public servants and professional risk managers in a way that I find incredibly impressive, even in combat, right? Like seeing what they're able to deal with from the full array. And so in this role, CISA, since election infrastructure was designated critical infrastructure in January 2017, CISA was asked to serve as the federal government lead for helping ensure the security and resilience of our nation's election infrastructure. So how did that come to be? Well, those of you who remember the 2016 presidential election, following Russia's efforts to interfere with that process, I think it was a bit of a wake-up call for this nation, recognizing that while elections may be political, election security is not. In fact, election security is national security. And so we have to approach it that way. And it is not fair for us to ask state and local officials to combat the threats posed by foreign adversaries and cyber criminals on their own. And that's where we have tremendous pride at CISA, serving as the federal government lead and partnering with these public heroes, these public servants, as well as other members of the federal government. We work incredibly closely with our colleagues in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in NSA and Cybercom. There is an incredible team of teams across the federal government that have made this mission a top priority. And that prioritization is really echoed all the way down through state and local government, especially as we go into this cycle. It is arguable that the 2024 threat environment is the most complex yet, with election officials facing a wide array of threats, from cyber, things like distributed denial of service and ransomware targeting local offices or government offices, to physical. I don't know if you all remember last year, but we saw instances of mail being laced with fentanyl, mailed deliberately to election offices. We've also seen consistent harassment and threats of violence against this community, largely preceded on unfounded claims that the 2020 election did not reflect the will of the American people. We've also seen things manifest like swatting and fake bomb calls targeting election offices, or swatting targeting chief election officials and their families. We've also seen the threat posed by foreign adversaries. And earlier in July, Odie and I put out an updated election threat briefing that talked about the continuing threat that foreign adversaries present to election security with respect to foreign influence operations and their persistent goal of undermining the public's confidence in our democratic institutions and sowing partisan discord here in the United States. In July, you also saw a statement come out from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence talking about how Iran in particular was using influence operations to try to foment protests around Israel-Gaza conflict. So when we talk about the complexity of this year's election threat landscape, there's a lot going on. But here is the good news. Our election infrastructure has truly never been more secure or resilient. And this election security community is more connected than ever. So as we talk about what we face, we talk about it with the confidence of knowing that for 250 years nearly, election officials around this country have administered free, fair, safe, secure elections to the American people, overcoming myriad things, from natural disasters like hurricanes. I don't know if anyone was in Florida in 2022, but that, talking about third costliest hurricane, I think, in Florida's history, having to administer elections like 2 weeks later, with 90+% of polling locations out of commission, to, this might be too young for this group, but about 10 years ago, Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy in the Northeast, okay? Anybody from New York, New Jersey, the Atlantic coast, right? Again, like administering democracy in the middle of a hurricane. Like, these folks do incredible things every day to overcome challenges. And they've done this amidst technological innovations that have fundamentally changed the way we lead our lives. So when we talk about election officials at the state and local level, these are incredible public servants who are also professional risk managers. And they are supported by a range of folks, from professional cybersecurity experts at the state and local level to also election vendors. So when we talk about the seriousness of this threat and the progress we've seen, especially over the past 8 years, election security vendors have stepped up, recognizing the importance of the technology they are providing that is underpinning the democratic process. And then we as a federal government have stepped up. We are providing, as CISA, more services to more jurisdictions than ever before. So yes, as we go into November, make no mistake, we are absolutely, completely aware of the complexity of the threat environment we face. But we are also completely confident in our team and the ability of those out there, state and local election officials, election vendors, supported by folks like the federal government, to take this on and in November deliver safe, secure, free, and fair elections to the American people. But this is something that everyone plays a role in. And so spending time with you all today, one of the most important things I think we will be facing in the coming weeks and months is you're going to see, and the American people are going to see, a lot of people pushing information. There's going to be a lot of noise in the information ecosystem. And we need help in ensuring that when it comes to facts about the elections process, the American people are going to the signal through the noise. Those who are truly the authoritative source on election administration, and that is state and local election officials. If you need to know what is going on about an elections process, it is state and local election officials who are the ones on the front lines, not just securing that process, but also managing and administering it. So over the course of the next several weeks and months, reinforcing the importance of The authoritative source of information pertaining to elections, the signal through the noise, are those election officials, and ensuring that we are amplifying their voice and making sure that they have the platform to communicate accurate facts to the American people. Now, all that being said, elections are complicated, as I started out at the beginning. These are complex operations that involve multiple domains, from the physical to the cyber to the information. And when you look at what an election day entails, right, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of election workers across the country, tens of thousands of voting locations, and if turnout is like 2020, over 150 million Americans going to cast their ballot. Things are going to go wrong on election day. They always have and they always will. Things like a tree falling on a power line and a polling location not having power for hours. We're going to see things like someone forgetting to bring the keys to a polling location and it, again, opening late. We're also going to see little things like election workers unplugging a system to plug in a crock pot for lunch. These things will happen. We're also probably going to see things in the cyber domain. We're going to see websites that weren't configured for increased traffic and potentially be inaccessible. We may even see a ransomware actor log out the state or county system on election day. But this is okay. All of this is okay. Because you know what? State and local election officials know this is just another day in election administration. They prepare for it. They train for it. They develop incident response plans that they rehearse. These things happen, and they happen in any type of sector operation. This isn't just unique to elections. And that's okay. I think what's really important going into the next several weeks and months is to put things in context, right? Just because there will be disruptions does not mean that those disruptions are going to impact the security or integrity of the process. And that's a really, really important point. So with that, happy to take any questions you all may have.
Great. As always, let me get the microphone to you. Ah, there it is. And identify yourself and news organization. We'll start going down this way.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Mike with the Associated Press. I think you were touching on this a little bit. Obviously we talked about Russia and Iran and those threats, but I think what we see more often than not over the last decade is actual changing of the narrative domestically by actors who are saying or are coming against the federal government, the sitting administration, for manipulating these polling locations and things like that. How do you combat stories that are coming from, the calls coming from within the House, that sort of thing?
So I think it's really important to also make note that our foreign adversaries, when they see these domestic narratives, we are helping them with their own objectives, right? Because what they do is they take domestic narratives and they amplify them to sow that domestic division. And so in some ways, unfortunately, when we do these things, we're actually helping our adversaries, because these are the exact types of messages that they look to capitalize on. I will say what we think is a more effective tactic in terms of ensuring the security and readiness of the election security community is to really focus less on where these things are originating from and more on the tactics themselves. And that's where you'll see a lot of our guidance is focused on how do election officials understand this threat? How do they prepare for it? And then how do they respond to mitigate its potential impact? In January of this year, we put out a product that talks about the role of generative AI and how that could potentially exacerbate some of the existing risks through things like foreign influence operations and disinformation, but also cyber. And TLDR is we don't think Gen AI is going to introduce fundamentally new risks for this election cycle, but it is going to exacerbate some of the existing. And then in April, working with our Office of the Director of National Intelligence colleagues, as well as our FBI colleagues, we put out a guidance document that talks about how to secure election infrastructure against the tactics of foreign influence operations. And again, I think it's less about who is conducting the operations or those tactics and just how to defend against those tactics in general. And I think this goes back to my comment on the importance of identifying the signal through the noise. So really at CISA, we try to do three things. The first is providing guidance documents about this threat. So I talked about some examples of that. The second thing we do is maintain a Room Reverse Reality webpage, which unpacks over 25 of the most common narratives that are used in these types of campaigns and provides facts around them. But what's even more important than CISA doing this is this actual service, if you will, or this I don't know what you call it, I guess, webpage style, is actually something that was adopted by most states across the country. And there's an organization called the National Association of Secretaries of State. They have a hashtag TrustedInfo 2024 campaign. But you can see on their website where many of these states have the equivalent Room Reverse Reality pages. So voters can actually go to their local state's page and understand the unique nuances and some of the common narratives that may be used specific to their state and really understand the facts around it. The third thing we do goes back to really emphasizing the state and local election officials are the authoritative source to help them with this and to help them prepare, because we do believe the thing that's really going to make a difference this year is communication. Election officials communicating with the public about what is going on, because that's going to be essential for confidence. So in May of this year, working with the Election Assistance Commission, we put together a communications guide. It's called Enhancing Public Confidence or Public Trust in Election Infrastructure Through Communication. Don't quote me on the title. It's a very long one, kind of like our name. But it's basically a comms guide for state and local election officials to help them put plans together, not just for election day, but year round, because building trust takes time. I will say what I think one of the best parts about this story is we have a good story to tell. Like, the facts are on the sides of the election officials. They've got a great story to tell when it comes to the security and resiliency of our election infrastructure. And it's really about getting that story out.
Quick follow-up. Is all that information available publicly online?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Who was that?
Hashtag Protect 2024.
We're going to go down there first and about that Texas. I had this little question. Look.
Hi, I'm Andy. I'm with E&E News at Politico. You mentioned how elections are partisan, but election security is nonpartisan. Donald Trump, who could potentially be in the White House next year, has allegedly benefited from election interference, and he's with his messaging and other tactics, worked to kind of undermine a lot of the elections process. How is your office kind of anticipating for or planning for his potential return to office and whatever that might entail with regard to election integrity?
So at CISA, we are an apolitical, nonpartisan organization. So we serve our mission regardless of who is in office where. And our mission is an incredibly important one. Right? We serve as the nation's cyber defense agency. And we also serve as the nation's national coordinator for critical infrastructure, security, and resilience. And so that mission persists and is why we exist and why we get out of bed every single day. And I think one of the beautiful things about this country is, our freedoms, and folks are entitled to their opinions. At the end of the day, that doesn't change what we do and what we owe the American people. The American people rely on critical infrastructure for every hour of every day, whether it's the water you drink, the electricity powering this room, the schools that educate our young. This is all the nation's critical infrastructure. And our mission is to help work with private sector partners to ensure its security and resilience. And so that is an unwavering mission that we are proud to do.
Back here, Jacob. Oh, thank you.
Hi, Jacob Lebenswitz with Scripps News. Thanks so much for doing this. CISA is housed underneath the federal government, but election administration is often done at the state and local level. And we've seen in the past year and beyond a number of states taking actions that might undermine election security within their own thing. So pulling out of ERIC, for example, as a result of some of these conversations we've been talking about voter fraud and whatnot. How do you as a federal government entity, try to communicate with states or officials who don't actually want to implement the recommendations that you're putting forward?
So you hit on a really important part of this, right? Which is working with us is voluntary. And when it comes to election administration, that is up to state and local officials. They are charged with managing, administering, and securing. But we also know that it's not fair to ask them to take that on alone, right? And so our approach has really been focused on working incredibly closely with state election offices to better understand their needs and what they are trying to do at both the state and local level to really tailor how CISA's services and what we bring to bear can best advance their security objectives. And so one of the ways that we've really invested in this space, because one of the things election officials will tell you, especially when you start this job and you're trying to figure out, what's going on and how things run, is if you've seen one state's election, you've seen one state's election, right? And it's so true because every state does it differently. And even internal to some states, some jurisdictions do it differently. So at CISA, we have an incredible group of federal public servants who are our field force, and they are across all states and territories. And they range from cybersecurity advisors to physical security advisors to emergency communications coordinators. And most recently, last year, recognizing the complexity of the election security mission and how nuanced it is, as an agency, we decided to hire regional election security advisors to help oversee our election security mission in each of the 10 regions that cover the country. So for those who aren't familiar with the Department of Homeland Security, we've got, think of a map of the US, and it's divided into 10 regions. So we hired an election security advisor for each of those 10 regions. And these folks are absolute rock stars. They are former election officials. They have over 210 years of collective election administration or election technology experience. And they have really just been an incredible force multiplier out in the field, helping us better understand how to tailor our services and where to lean in to meet those election officials where they are. And that's the most important thing. If we have to be able to offer things that they can use and implement effectively with the resources they have available, right? And I think we're really proud of the investment we've made there. And that's where, going back to my earlier point, we've provided more services and we've had more engagement with more jurisdictions than ever before. As an example, so just starting from January of last year, we've provided over 1,050 physical security assessments of election facilities. We've provided over 700 cyber assessments of election facilities. Every week, we have a service called Cyber Hygiene Vulnerability Scanning, where we send weekly reports to nearly 1,000 election entities on any potential internet-facing vulnerabilities on their websites or their systems. When it comes to training and readiness, that's been a huge investment, especially this year. We've conducted over 150 tabletop exercises with election entities. We've done, I think, over 440 trainings reaching 28,000 election stakeholders. So I feel very good about the rapport and the relationships that we've built with these stakeholders who are the frontline defenders. They are the lead actor or actress, and we are totally the supporting cast, right? But I will say, just in this job, I've had the privilege of, I think I've met with every single state's either chief election official or state election director. Almost. And their commitment to ensuring the highest degree of security and resilience of the process is unquestionable. And so I think that's really where we just try to be the best partners possible with them.
Just to quickly follow up on that, if I may. There's been a number of proposals in Congress to try to strengthen the federal government's role in election administration, give it more funding, sort of institute requirements across the board. Is that something that you guys would support? And is there sort of one thing that you feel like Congress might be able to do that would give the agency, a better ability to protect against vulnerabilities?
So I do think that consistent funding at the federal, state, and local level is important for this infrastructure community to continue to make security improvements, right? We have an evolving threat environment, so our security must also evolve to meet that threat environment. And with respect to within the Department of Homeland Security, we try to help state and local election officials with some of the resourcing gaps through a couple grant programs we offer. So we offer the Homeland Security Grant Program, which has a 3% minimum spend for election security. So if states are going to be utilizing Homeland Security Grant Program funds, minimum of 3% must go to election security. We also have the State and Local Cybersecurity Grant Program. And I think an important thing to note here is most election offices ride on the IT infrastructure of state or local government, right? So really when we talk about moving the needle in election security, it has to be moving the needle in state and local government election security, cyber and physical security.
Here, Jesus.
Hi, Jesus Rodriguez with the Washington Post. Thanks for doing this. You were talking about information, and I really like the point you were making there about people pushing lots of different kinds of information in the coming months. You're here talking to us as journalists, people who should be putting forth facts in our reporting, and that's what we do. But the reality, I think, is also that people consume content and news in a lot of different ways. So I have kind of a two-part question. First part is I'm just curious if you do kind of similar work with alternative forms of media, like people on TikTok, people on YouTube, podcasters who are reaching audiences that we don't reach. Just thinking about how people consume news today.
That's a great question. And I am probably the least cool person when it comes to public media engagement or social media engagement. So we have, agency accounts in terms of on some of the most major platforms. But you bring up a really good point in terms of how do we get to audiences that aren't our normal audiences. So you can imagine being in cyber and infrastructure security, sometimes our following is a bit niche. So I will say one thing, and then Scott, I'm going to turn this to you because I think you may be able to answer that better too in some of our approach, but I'll buy you some time by talking about something else we're doing. So one way we are trying to do this is I talk a lot about the services we offer to election infrastructure stakeholders, right? And our work with state and local election officials and election vendors and state and local government. But we recognize the importance of getting this message out to the American people. So as we talk about ensuring these stakeholders understand the threat environment, so too must the American people. And we've really tried to tackle that this year in a public service announcement campaign that we're doing with the FBI. It is not when I say that, people are like, oh, there's videos. And I'm like, no, there's no videos. But we do press releases essentially with the FBI around some of the most likely cyber incidents we're likely to see and putting them in context for, again, while they may be disruptive, kind of dispelling concerns over how they may impact the security or integrity of the process, and how that narrative, the unfactual narrative that they do, could be something our foreign adversaries exploit. So we put out our first public service announcement with the FBI, I think back in July, and that was focused on distributed denial of service attacks against websites. We put out a second one on ransomware, basically saying, a county election office may get locked up with ransomware, just like their county website might get DDoSed. But you know what's not going to happen? Those things are not going to have any impact on the security or integrity of the systems that Americans use to actually cast their, or the systems that election officials use to count those votes. So in terms of the American people's confidence that their votes are going to be counted as cast, these things should not undermine that at all. And just yesterday, we put out another PSA on voter registration system security. And one of the common narratives we expect foreign adversaries have and may continue to use is, they and cyber criminals actually do this. They will take things like voter registration data that is legitimately available, either publicly or through commercial means, and spin access to that data as evidence of an election infrastructure compromise. I mean, it's crazy. You see cyber criminals on the, dark web selling free information for like $30 a pop. It's great margins, But it's that kind of stuff where trying to educate the American people on, hey, here's the stuff to know so you don't fall for what Iran or Russia may be trying to spin. But I do love your ideas on being more creative and outreach. Scott, what do you think?
But
Sure. I mean, that's something that first of all, I'm Scott McConnell. I work in the press shop at CISA, so that's why.
He's on election security as Fox.
We really have, over the last couple of months, made a concerted effort to realize that, with all due respect to this organization, it's not all of the reporters in D.C. That Americans get their news from. So we've done a few things. One is we are working really hard to get our director, Jen Easterly, on as many kind of non-news programs as possible. So it's an uphill battle because it's a little bit of a difficult story to tell in terms of why this will be interesting to people. But we're trying to pitch her as much as we can on some of the daytime television shows, on some of the late night shows. I mean, again, it's a challenge, but we realize that like a lot of Americans get their news that way, not from the evening news programs. The other thing, or the newspaper. The other thing that we have done that we've had more success at is we realize that a lot of Americans get their news at the local level, right? They get it at the 5 o'clock NBC, ABC affiliate while they're watching dinner, or the 11 o'clock news at night. So we have been on the road. We have been meeting with state and local election officials, and every chance we get when we do those meetings is we try to do a joint either press conference or interview or something with the local officials. So just on Tuesday of last week, I believe it was, you were in New Hampshire.
This week. The
This
boss
week.
was, yep.
Oh, God. So we were in New Hampshire this week. We're going to be in Idaho next week, in Boise. You've been to probably 30 different states at this point in 2024. So we really have made a concerted effort to kind of get outside of the Beltway and talk to people where they are, where they consume their news. As far as other platforms, that is something we're still working on, right? It is, I think, probably a challenge that every federal agency faces is, all right, how do you get on to, and, get talking to some of the influencers on social media and that sort of thing. So that's something that is, frankly, something we're still working on, but it's something that we are focused on.
And you all should consider maybe joining the federal team as external affairs or press affairs folks, on your career journey to bring some of that new and exciting approaches to help us be better at being transparent,
Be better job security.
Just the second part of my question. Thank you for that. You're pointing out that with, when you're talking about foreign adversaries and all of that, you're pointing out that when, people put forth these narratives about election security that sometimes are misinformation, that's not so simple, right? There's a complicated web that comes before that. And I think for a lot of us who encounter voters out in the field and who talk to them about, the elections are secure, and try to present facts, sometimes that's hard to get that point through to them. I'm just curious if you've ever encountered someone in your work who doesn't trust the elections and who thinks the results are not to be trusted, that the system's rigged, and has there been one thing that you've been able to tell them that convinces them otherwise?
I love this question. And I'm not connected to just also the heightened level of threats and harassment that election officials are facing, right? I think one of the messages we try to really tell to everyone is when you talk about the democratic process and these frontline defenders that are the American state and local election official, they're not strangers. They're not people you don't know. They're your friends. They're your family. They're the people you see in your community when you go grocery shopping, or to a movie theater. These are the people that are throughout our communities that are underpinning this process. And so I think humanizing those individuals, right? They're not faceless bureaucrats. They're people, and they're people we know. And I think that's really important too, because when we talk about trust, people trust people. And for them to have faith in institutions, sometimes they need to know the people who are part of those institutions. And I think that's a message we really try to emphasize is these people are part of your communities. I think the other part that we try to really get across are some of the most important security and resilience measures that just go back to why you should have confidence in the system. As we look at this year, right, and election security and resilience, these election officials apply multiple layers of physical, procedural, and cyber controls to ensure the security and resilience of all election infrastructure. And those are really important things. They're things like ensuring that the systems where Americans cast their actual vote, those systems, those vote casting systems, are not connected to the internet. When it comes to the technology that's out in the field being used, again, across tens of thousands of polling locations, those systems are tested before they're actually fielded and put out for use to ensure their security and accuracy. When you talk about post-election day, every state has their own version of some validation or audit process. And I think one of the most important things for this year, just kind of going back to if there is a question over the outcome of an election, it is estimated that 97% of registered voters in America live in a jurisdiction where they're going to get a paper record of their vote that they can verify. These paper records can be counted and recounted and audited. And that's a really important part of resiliency, right? And confidence in the system and the outcome. Because again, if there's a question over the accuracy, recount, right? And like there's all these processes in place. So I think just at the end of the day, the important thing is the people are people we trust and know, and the process has all of these measures built in for security and resilience to ensure that it can withstand the threats it's facing. And I apologize, I do think I need to run because the car is coming at 10 o'clock.
Sneak one in as she's walking out the door.
You talked about the adversaries, China, Russia. I'm wondering if there are more that are interested in throwing, misinformation. And are their agendas the same? Or do they differ in their agenda? Do they want to favor a particular candidate, or do they just want to sow mistrust and division?
No, great question. So the Office of the Director of National Intelligence puts out various publications. There's the annual threat assessment at the beginning of every year, but then also after every federal election, the Department of Homeland Security, alongside the Department of Justice and ODNI, we put out respective publications assessing if there was any material impact by foreign adversaries on the security or integrity of the elections process. And when it came to the 2022 election, I think this observation is a really important one that ODNI put out and has since been echoing in their various updates, which is we are seeing a growing and diverse number of actors trying to influence our democratic process. And they unpack it a bit more with like who some of those actors are. But I think that's just the reality we have to be prepared for, right? When we go back to arguably the most complex threat environment yet in 2024. And this is also why I go back to like why actor agnostic is important. We need to be defending against the tactics, regardless of who is behind them. And so that's where we need to be prepared, whether it's 3 or 30 entities that look to come after our democratic process. But we are. Like that mentality, that methodology is what we are using. And that is why I have tremendous confidence that in November, election officials around this country will deliver safe, secure, free, and fair elections for the American people.